will break the back of the energy crisis. We will lay the foundation for our future capacity to meet America's energy needs from America's own resources. 1974 must be the year in which we organize a full-scale effort to provide for our energy needs, not only in this decade, but through the 21st century. At the end of this decade, in the year 1980, the United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, to heat our homes, and to keep our transportation moving.
The world price of petroleum has quadrupled in the last year. I'm recommending a plan to make us invulnerable to cutoffs of foreign oil. It will require sacrifices, but and this is most important, it will work. Bluntly, I must remind you that we have not made satisfactory progress toward achieving energy independence. Energy is absolutely vital to the defense of our country, to the strength of our economy, and to the quality of our lives. Such vulnerability at present or in the future is intolerable and must be ended.
Our excessive dependence on foreign oil is a clear and present danger to our nation's security.
And here we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world.
For more than 30 years, we've been hearing that this is a problem. Why hasn't something been done? America is more dependent now than ever on foreign suppliers of energy. Is there any solution to this problem? If there is, why hasn't the problem been solved?
I mean, given all the technology we have in this world, it's remarkable that we haven't had an alternative to the combustion engine or an adaptation to the combustion engine that makes the petroleum last longer. And many have long thought that oil companies have bought up patents to allow them to continue to make more money. No one's proven it.
If technology exists to improve gas mileage, why hasn't someone seen it?
A man came to the airfield one day with a 1946 Buick Roadmaster. He had invented a carburetor that was water injected and could get close to 100 miles per gallon. He told us that Shell Oil Company had bought the patent from him, which made him a millionaire. Shell told him he could keep the one on this Buick, but could build no more. Now, the Buick Roadmaster was a very heavy car. Can you imagine what that would save on the lightweight cars of today and our energy consumption? Also, the oil industries would have gone broke. My question, whatever happened to this invention? It's been over 55 years, and I'm sure if it was put on the market with today's technology, it could be even more improved. Sincerely, K.R. Cundy, senior citizen.
There has long been a legend of a water-injected carburetor that enabled amazing gas mileage. Did this man see it?
Well, when he drove out that day, we were racing our cars and we didn't think much of him. We saw this Buick. It was fairly new. I thought maybe he was going to race us too. But he just sat there and he talked to us, and pretty soon he said, I can make this car get close to 100 miles a gallon, and we thought he was just blowing steam, And he raised the hood and we looked at it. I don't know, it just looked like a bunch of crap on there, But anyway, we looked at it and didn't think much of it because it was just a gadget as far as we were concerned, so we didn't think too much more about it. Had to have been 48 or 49 Yeah, those old Buicks, it had 4 holes on the fenders. And that's how you could tell whether it was a 3-holer was a special and a 4-holer was a Roadmaster. And they were big, they were heavy. He mentioned that he had built 3 or 4 of them. He put them on a couple of other cars. We were sitting there talking about it, and he said that Shell told him he couldn't rebuild anymore. And he says, they bought my patent and made me a millionaire.
Proving that gets to be a little more of an issue.
Yeah, we looked at it because it was different, you know, something new. And how it worked, I couldn't tell you. Because it was really just a gimmick to us. You know, we didn't think anything would ever come of it.
Buick Roadmaster, curb weight, 4,465 pounds. Hummer H3, curb weight, 4,700 pounds. The Roadmaster weighs almost as much as a Hummer. What if a Hummer could get 100 miles to the gallon? Did Shell Oil really bury this technology?
They've done a pretty good job covering it up. People who've looked haven't been able to find those patents on the record.
In 1946, a man living within 20 miles of Modesto, California, where Ken Cundy raced cars, registered this patent.
This particular device is a very simple concept that takes water and humidifies it and allows that humidified air to be drawn into a carburation system, such as an internal combustion engine in an automobile. Conceptually, I can see it does a few things. When you add humidity to the air, it allows the thermal properties of the air to cool the engine and make a more even combustion process, which prevents pre-ignition, and that's one of the claims in the patents. So,
it may readily be seen that with a device of this kind, higher compression ratios can be utilized, materializing more power and fuel economy, and also permitting the use of lower-grade fuels.
That alone is a big improvement in the efficiency of an engine. We all have had the knock in our automobiles before, and so this reduces that. It can also increase power, I believe, by allowing you to use a lower octane gas or just increase your torque. Either one is possible. So I see fuel economy opportunities with this.
Why don't we know about this technology?
Why? That's the question I'm asking, and why I wrote the letter. I says, what happened to that?
Who would you call if you had this idea?
Would you call Shell scientists? What if they had a laboratory less than 10 miles from your house?
Here at the Agricultural Laboratory near Modesto, California, it's a modern laboratory, complete to the last detail.
The old Shell building still exists today. The inventor's son was originally excited to participate in this film, but will no longer return our phone calls.
I believe that maybe Shell wants to sell gas.
Representatives from Shell Oil declined to speak to us.
If I was running an oil company, I would want to make you desire my product as much as possible. And since we're running out of the resource globally, the price for them can only go up. So they're trying to squeeze blood from the stone. They're realizing that they're in the most profitable portion of their business right now. Of course they're doing that. That makes sense.
In 1977, the book Fuel Economy of the Gasoline Engine, which was published by the Shell Oil Company, documents that Shell scientists were able to achieve 149.95 miles per gallon on a 1947 Studebaker. This book is out of print and has disappeared from the Library of Congress. Here are the pages. The Shell Oil Company would not talk to the filmmakers, but in February of 2007, they were able to interview a retired Shell scientist living in England.
My name is David Blackmore, and I worked for quite some years in Shell research. I edited the book called Fuel Economy of the Gasoline Engine. And we normally would test our fuels in real or sometimes prototype vehicles and engines that we would have contact with the motor industry, the motor manufacturers. It began in one form or another. 60 years ago, just before World War II, 1939.
A race to see how much gasoline we need to run our car 1/4 of a mile.
During the first vehicle just before the war, I think that particular one was in fact a converted vehicle from a road vehicle at the time, and I think that first one was something like 49, 50 miles per US gallon. When the specials began, it was they managed to get into the hundreds of miles per gallon, but there was still some quite excitement in a few years before the 1,000 mile per gallon barrier was broken, which I think didn't happen until the late 1970s.
What have we been doing while scientists have been getting 1,000 miles per gallon?
The technology's there. It's just no one wants to pay attention to it.
Well, the technology is there, and we could use it in the marketplace. There's no will to do so.
Did this man witness an invention that could have changed history?
I wish we had it today.
I remember reading the patent and going, God, I could do this. This would be easy. I could do that on my old Mustang. The idea is great. I really enjoy reading things like that. People who aren't afraid to say, hey, why aren't we doing this?
It's not unakin to what the oil companies and the motor companies did in Los Angeles when they used their money and their political connections to tear up mass transit lines in order to make way for more automobiles so they can sell more cars and more gasoline.
That is done often. In fact, most patents never get used, either because they're maybe not that great of an idea, or somebody squelches it, such as you might be suggesting here.
As opposed to a local ripoff of Los Angeles, for which there was actually convictions. This is a worldwide ripoff. This is a worldwide crime. It's a crime that is potentially responsible for the polar ice caps melting, for the Icelandic coast falling off, for the warmer weather we're going to have continually, according to scientists, because of the pollution. If we use less petroleum, a lot less petroleum, because there was better technology, our planet would be there longer.
I would bet that the gas prices back in those days were probably around 5 cents per gallon, and the goal was to sell as many gallons as possible. So if Shell, the Shell Group, had their capitalistic hat on, they want to sell as much of it as they possibly can. And maybe nothing else mattered. I don't know their corporate ethics. And maybe it's just pure greed.
If this device had been used instead of shelved, what would the world be like today?
That can't be possible, but it is possible. My name's Ernie Pierce, and for a living I work for Continental Airlines. Started out as a mechanic and worked my way up to where I was a technical supervisor. Along came this article in the paper about a gentleman named Tom Ogle down in El Paso, Texas, and he invented a car that would get 100 miles to the gallon. And so I was really interested in this idea. So I read this article and it showed a picture of his car, and the more I read, the more interested I got in what he was doing. So I had an old 72 Pinto sitting in the backyard, and I said, I'm going to try this thing. So I took this 72 Pinto and got myself a propane tank for my little project. So I took the propane tank and took it to a guy and had a chamber put on the bottom, like Tom did with his. One thing you have to understand, the only thing that makes a cylinder pop is vapor. When you run a carburetor, the only thing that makes a cylinder pop is vapor. When you run fuel injection, the only thing that makes that engine run is vapor. It's whatever vaporizes in that cylinder under pressure that burns. Raw gasoline will not burn. If you flood a car, you can't get it started, and it's got all the gasoline in the world in it. So if you only put vapor in the cylinder, you're going to get 100% burn. It's not anything like the car that I worked on, but I can give you an example of what I would do if I wanted to run this car on vapor. I'd take the suction line and I'd hook it up to a tank here so it was pulling a vacuum into this suction line. It would run through the air conditioning compressor out the pressure line. I put a reducer on it and bring it around and put a vapor carburetor here and run it through a vapor carburetor. So I run on vapor. If I ran out of gas vapor, I'd flip a switch and I'd run on gasoline. So that's the secret. Now that's basically what Tom did. He was running strictly on vapor that comes off of gasoline. That's why he got 100 miles to the gallon. I didn't get 100 miles to the gallon with my system because it wasn't as good as it could be. But if you took it to a dealer or a major company, They could improve upon the idea then, and we'd have something fantastic today.
What happened to Ernie's invention?
When I was working on this project, I went to Las Vegas and was sitting in a parking lot out there, and out of the clear blue sky, he hollers at me, "Did you ever hear the story about Tom Ogle?" And I said, "Well, what about him?" And they said, "Well, you know, he's the guy that invented the vapor car." I said, "Okay." He said, "They found him in the desert dead from an overdose of drugs." I said, "Is that right?" He said, "Well, you don't think for a minute that they'd let one man change the way they do business with gasoline, do you?" Just dawned on me, why would that guy holler at me? I never prompted anything about anything but this. Now, isn't that amazing? I was ready to run this car on Riverside Raceway. I had the manager at Riverside Raceway ready to set that up with the press and everything. And this man told me, he says, "I'll give you 6 months and you're a dead man." But when you find out that Tom's not here anymore and they found him out in the desert dead, that's where they found him, that opens your eyes a little bit. We'd gone back home and I'd continued working on the car. But about 2 weeks after that, my wife noticed them first. Who are those two guys sitting out in front of the house all the time? I have no idea. They just made themselves very visible. We knew after a while, after about 2 weeks, they were watching us, and we knew why. You know, there's two guys sitting across the street with a video camera. You know who they are. Why else would they be sitting there? You know, it's pretty obvious. That was enough. I just let it go. I didn't want my wife to get hurt, and I didn't want to get hurt, so I just took all the parts off the car, put the car up for sale, and sold the car. Ford Motor Company, if you want to work on this system with me, all you got to do is give me a call. So.
It seems like somebody would be able to break through, that the oil companies can't kill off every single person who comes up with those ideas.
What actually happened to Tom Ogle and his invention?
I suppose there's probably not a month goes by what I think about it, maybe sometimes just days. Just think about it. Tom Ogle and his invention and what could have happened, and especially when I'm watching the nightly business report and see that crude oil prices is up to $90 and maybe going to be $100. Well, Tom was, he seemed like a likable sort of fella. He was friendly and everything. I think he, like a lot of teenagers, you know, he liked to have his good fun and stuff, you know.
Tom Ogle worked for Wiley's friend Jim Peck in his auto shop. It was during this time when he told Jim about his idea for the vapor engine.
So I would go out to the shop at different times and talk to him and things like that. But he didn't have too much time for a lot of foolishness. He was working on that car. Here's a picture here of Tom. And Jim told him, just go ahead and work on it. Don't bother about anything else. So the car belonged to Jim Peck. And so Jim bought all the parts, anything he needed to go on there. So that tank was pressurized to such a point and also heated. You had a certain amount of heat and the pressure. And the two together caused nothing but vapor to go in for the burning. And so that's what he got 100 miles per gallon by that. On the day of the trial to run this thing out to see what the actual mileage would be, Jim Peck gave me a call and said, Wiley, come on out to the shop and bring your car, and we're going to Deming, New Mexico, on a test run. Before we left, they drained all the gasoline out of this car, went across the street with a little can, got 2 gallons of gasoline, and brought back and poured it in there. And did this right inside the shop. One of Jim Peck's drivers drove my car, and we followed Tom Ogle in this car. That thing would run too. That thing would. We had to kind of step on the gasoline to keep up with it. So we went to Deming, which was 100 miles from El Paso, and we made an exit there over to Holiday Inn. Stopped and went in. We all sat around a little round table there and had a cup of coffee. And while we were there, well, several people came in for our autographs and so forth. And then after we left there, we came back to, got as far as El Paso, and it ran out of gasoline right just about the center of the city. So we checked it out, and it still came to just a fraction over 200 miles that we had made with 2 gallons of gasoline.
After that fateful trip to New Mexico, Tom became a local celebrity. Not only does Ogle's car promise more miles per gallon, but he says it will clean the environment. I've had the oil companies try to buy my unit with the agreement that I'd never build another. I refused to sell, and the only thing they had left was to try and break me in court.
So it makes you kind of wonder how they got to him and got that thing, if he felt that way. But
eventually, Tom found a company in Washington that he felt would take his invention to market.
They claimed that they were going to take it up to their place, and they had the technicians and everything that was going to refine that thing, you know, up to a better point than what it was.
His was sophisticated enough to get him dead.
After his Oglemobile was taken away, Tom was found dead in his car. According to an investigator, his death was due to alcohol and an apparent overdose of the drug Darvon.
I've often wondered about that. They found him out, found him dead.
It was often speculated that Tom's death was due to suicide.
Quite a few that I've talked to said that they really didn't think it was suicide. Somebody got to him, but nobody really knows.
After Tom's death, the company that took the car stated the engine did not work. After that, the Oglemobile disappeared. Tom's widow, Monica, said she was too frightened to discuss his story with us.
These things that you witness like that, you know, it sure makes you wonder why something hadn't been done before this time. And it's not a hoax, because there was too many people there that witnessed it, and we'd have no idea where that old Ford is now. Makes you wonder why somebody, with all, like you say, with all that technology now, why they haven't come up with something that would get us better gas mileage, and nothing has been done on getting us any automobiles or anything else that'll get that kind of gas mileage.
They would not let you do it. And I don't know that they would today.
If this is all true, why would oil companies keep resisting better technology?
Corporations, of course, are not set up to be good citizens. They're set up to be money-making machines, and they happen to have the most profitable money-making machine in the world.
Well, there's this operant paradigm that gets, really lodged in people's brains called greed. And when you look at the profits of the oil companies today, it's a no-brainer why this is still going on. And yet, why people aren't standing up to resist it is a question that I certainly don't have an answer for.
In just 25 years, global energy demand is expected to increase nearly 50%, with oil and natural gas needed to meet the majority of that demand.
The amount of petroleum products that are consumed is so enormous, it's hard to even comprehend.
At current market prices, the bill for the world's petroleum consumption is more than $2.5 trillion a year. That's greater than the U.S. government's entire annual budget.
Smell the coffee.
Are the oil companies really sticking it to our gas hole?
Just a yes or no answer.
Well, Senator, there are no easy yes or no answers in this business.
It's just a simple question.
No, it's much more complex than that.
He's right. After this disaster, gas prices rise above $3 a gallon for the first time in U.S. history.
Our people have a growing suspicion that the oil companies are taking unfair advantage of the current market conditions to line their coffers with excess profits.
Oil's a very interesting market. It is probably the market which is most impacted by political turmoil. It is very heavily impacted by weather, especially when you talk of things like Rita and Katrina, because we produce a lot of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. And Texas has major refineries, and Louisiana has major refineries. And when those hurricanes moved in, I mean, it took a lot of our refining capacity offline. It shut down a lot of the production wells. Supply decreases dramatically, and as a result, prices go up.
So you had, in that case, what we were calling, in technical terms, the double whammy effect, in which you were seeing higher prices due to higher crude oil prices, but also due to the gasoline market.
You know, I'd come home on the weekend and it had gone up another 25, 50, 65 cents a gallon.
There was a lot of complaint that prices went up excessively after the hurricanes. As you stated, that Exxon had record profits over that time period.
The more crude they own and the less they have to buy, that does generate some very serious profit.
Before Katrina, every time we raised a problem with the gasoline prices, the oil industry always said, oh, it's the world price of crude oil. We got to pay $78 a gallon. It intuitively made sense, even though they weren't paying those prices. They had their own crude oil operations.
I can see how people might look at that and be suspicious.
The news media is fabulous for the oil industry. They might as well buy the news stations and run them.
Presented as a public service by Standard Oil Company.
Any kind of crisis that comes up, I mean, Middle East to hurricane to any natural disaster, they use all of that information, I feel.
For as much concern as there was about the rising gas prices, you know, did the gas prices reach a point where millions and millions of people decided to get a new vehicle or decided to cut out the family vacation or everyone decided to carpool? No, it didn't reach that. It wasn't large enough for people on a real broad scale to change the kinds of cars that they drive or the kinds of fuel that they're going to seek out.
You know, I think the real wake-up call could be, you know, global warming and the Katrina, things like that. But I think it's going to take a tidal wave coming over LA or something for people to be like, oh, maybe there's a correlation there.
After Katrina, the oil companies had to scramble for a lot better explanations.
In the fall of 2005, the major oil companies all report record-breaking profits. Congressional leaders, feeling pressure from Americans, call the oil executives to explain themselves.
Could we have quiet, please? I shall not administer an oath today.
Mr. Chairman, I would like the committee to vote on whether we swear
There will be no vote. That's not in order at all. It's the decision of the chairman, and I have made that decision.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we swear in the witnesses.
And I rule that out of order.
I second the motion.
That's the last we're going to hear about that because it's out of order.
Congressional hearings are part of the essential work that the Congress does. You build a record in a hearing by asking questions of the witnesses, the professionals that come in, the people that are part of the issue, whatever the issue is.
And I think Americans are concerned. In the midst of suffering, in the midst of sacrifice, record-breaking profits.
These oil executives were not sworn in. How can we get answers if they don't have to tell the truth?
Corporations are supposed to make a profit. That's what they do. They do it incredibly well, some of them. But there has to be the counterbalance, the social counterbalance, which is what our leaders are supposed to do. Our public representatives are supposed to represent the public.
Congressional hearings are very, very important, and they are supposed to instruct our work. My sense that day is that it was more PR than anything else.
Here, obviously, this is the most important hearing to the pocketbooks of the American people.
I think that it was meant to give the American people the impression that we were going to do something, thinking very hard about doing something about the increasing cost of gas at the pump.
In the aftermath of September the 11th, the price jumped about 40 cents a gallon, and you all stepped in, froze the prices, and assured the distribution, and things settled down.
Does that mean oil companies can control the prices at the pump?
In the aftermath of Katrina, likewise, the price rose about 40 cents almost overnight. And so why would there not be the similar response?
In our own case, in the directly affected areas, we froze the price. Outside those areas, what we tried to do was maintain continuity of supply and at the same time avoid a shortage.
We get no crude from the Gulf, and yet the prices in the West Coast spiked as well.
I think most consumers find it terribly unfair, and you know, talk is cheap. They're saying to Congress, we want some action.
As the response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita have proved, markets work, even under the most extraordinary circumstances.
You know, Katrina actually proved to us exactly how the market doesn't work, because you have an example where there's a hurricane, oil production stops, and the price climbs up to $5 a gallon some places. Okay, that's because it's scarce, but that gasoline wasn't made after Katrina hit. It didn't cost that much to make the gasoline. It was made before Katrina at the $2 a gallon price. So I think the public had an awakening. What you're paying for gasoline isn't what it costs to make it.
Are you telling the committee today that had we not had the hurricanes, that your profits would be even higher?
It doesn't make any sense to believe anybody who's producing oil about anything that they have to say, because it is in their best interest to lie. And I don't blame them for lying. They just want their money. That's why they're lying. But to base your public policy on a bunch of known liars seems like idiocy.
Oil companies have raised gasoline far in excess of the jumps in crude oil prices. Even if you take for granted that they actually paid the world price for crude oil, which they don't, oil companies' prices still went up. For instance, from January to April of 2006 by about 60 cents, and the price of crude oil only went up 12 cents a gallon.
That's 48 cents above the cost of crude oil.
So even if you believe what they say, they're still gouging.
But if you have a good hearing, what you learn in a hearing can change your views about some things because you have professionals testifying. That's not what that day was about.
History teaches us that punitive measures hastily crafted in reaction to short-term market fluctuations will likely have unintended negative consequences, including creating disincentives for investment in domestic projects.
Does this sound like a threat to send their record profits out of the country?
We haven't had a new refinery in the United States of America built in the last 30 years, not one. Demand for gasoline has gone up 30%. These refineries have become more efficient, so capacity, supply has only gone up 10%. That is a recipe for huge prices and big profits. And we have some memos from oil companies from the mid-90s where they articulated exactly this issue.
If the U.S. petroleum industry doesn't reduce its refining capacity, it will never see any substantial increase in refining margins.
They said, we have too much refining capacity and we've got to cut it back if we want to make big profits. It's on paper, and yet oil companies insist they do nothing wrong.
Oil companies try to limit refinery capacity?
Because there's huge amounts of that going on.
We had a big run-in with Shell up in Bakersfield.
Your company, Shell, announced it was closing its oil refinery in Bakersfield, California, an oil refinery that supplied 2% of our state's gas. We already had some of the highest gas prices in the country, and the community was up in arms.
And very quickly it became apparent that Shell was lying.
This was a struggle to get Shell to cooperate with us. The Attorney General had to force them, in essence, to open up their books.
We got some documents showing this was actually the most profitable refinery in Shell's entire system in the world.
Internal documents showed Bakersfield Refinery was making the biggest marginal profit of any Shell refinery in the country. So could you please explain why your company put out that word, that there were no buyers? That wasn't true. That the refinery wasn't reliable? That wasn't true. That the refinery wasn't making money? That wasn't true. Was it because you wanted to control the supply of gasoline?
They wanted to shut it down because if they could make less gasoline, they can make more money.
It seemed to us, and in retrospect still does, that there was a desire to short the market even more.
If you don't have the capacity that you say you should have, then the costs are greater because it's going to take longer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It all kind of leads to one place, and that is
record-breaking profits.
The way oil companies make big money is by artificially reducing supply so that the market's running almost on empty with just a week or two of inventories. And then when there's a crisis to the system, the market sends the price of gasoline through the roof because it's a commodities market. There's a sense that there's a shortage. So oil companies can then charge $3.50 for gasoline that costs them $1 something to make. And that's how they record the biggest profits in the history of the world quarter after quarter recently.
Unsatisfied, Congress had an additional hearing on May 11, 2006 to investigate the capacity of U.S. refineries.
In just 25 years, global energy demand is expected to increase nearly 50%.
Can you explain then why ExxonMobil has said it doesn't plan to build any new refineries in the United States? Are they looking for new ways to invest their record profits?
We are not
you aware
advised.
of the comments of ExxonMobil?
I am aware of those comments, yes.
And do you want to comment on those comments? I mean, they run contrary to what the committee is basing many of its, or at least some of its decisions on. I see that the chairman is, the distinguished chairman of the full committee is laughing, except it was our staff here at the committee.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be glad to.
I'm not laughing at you. I'm
just
saying
think it's the subject matter.
How unfair it is of you to quote their own words. It's a low blow to use what ExxonMobil has actually said against them. I mean, that's kind of a cheap shot, don't you think?
Well, I think that's what my constituents would want me to do. It's their quote.
So I guess it was a tough question, but I thought that it was an incriminating statement that they had made.
And we weren't laughing at you, we were laughing with you. We were thinking about the lady who came over.
This is strictly business, Mr. Chairman, and I understand that.
I know that. Red probably didn't really want to answer that question. I wouldn't have if I'd have been him.
Right.
But you asked good questions.
Thank
we admire you. We weren't laughing at you.
No. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, what that said to me was that I'd made a good point.
How can Americans put faith in investigative hearings when the two chairmen have taken more than $1.5 million from the oil and gas industries?
We need to be more angry as a citizenship because we're being failed by the people that we put in power. And the arrogance of most of the people in power, and that's Democrat and Republican, that they somehow deserve or have the right to be, is obnoxious. They work for us. And when they do something that is so obviously against our best interest, we should fire them. We should vote them out.
When Representative Barton's press secretary was asked for a comment to explain why,
it's a low blow to use what ExxonMobil has actually said against them.
The response was, that seems to be the norm on our committee. Ask anybody.
Texans on the committee fight very, very hard to protect the oil industry, the refineries, and that, so much of which is based in Texas.
It's like a judge who takes money from the plaintiffs and the defendants, and whoever gives more is the one who gets the verdict their way.
Congress, for one thing, is a reactive institution. I thought when I first was elected that it was proactive and that, we'd think things through and we'd read wonderful books and have authors discussing the theme of their well-written theses, and that out of that we would debate that, and then we'd have great legislation. I don't know what got into me.
Of course, the oil companies have spent literally tens of millions of dollars in campaign contributions to stop all real reform.
As long as I am chairman, regulating global warming pollution is off the table indefinitely. I don't want there to be any uncertainty about that.
Everybody in the Congress has money flowing in from a variety of interests, and you can always point to the conflicts of interest.
I think it's larger than Chairman Barton and larger than Congressman Hall.
And I might ask Shell if you're interested in shale oil in Wyoming as well as Colorado.
Absolutely, Senator.
I know that.
People really believe, for the most part, that we're all bought and paid for.
Since 1990, the oil and gas industry has contributed more than $49 million to the Democrats, more than $150 million to the Republicans. Since George W. Bush was elected, the oil and gas industry has contributed more than $19 million to the Democrats, more than $82 million to the Republicans.
Unfortunately, these powerful, rich, greedy people can sequester a tremendous amount of political influence with the dollars that they're taking out of the pockets of every working person in this country, and they're funneling those profits to completely contradict the correct interests of those people.
They got the money to do it, they do it, and it's the worst type of political corruption.
These are huge sums of money, and of course they come into play. Of course they do. I mean, you'd have to be totally naive to say that it doesn't have some kind of effect.
In January 2001, when President Bush took office, the average price of gasoline was $1.47. In May 2007, the average price of gasoline was $3.12. It went from $1.47 to $3.12 in less than 2 terms.
This administration is too close to the oil industry. It's too close to the oil interests. I mean, we have 2 people as president and vice president who really came from the oil industry. And so, in a sense, they're way too close to the oil industry to give it the kind of scrutiny that it needs.
Even if you're not getting money from big oil, if you go after big oil, they're going to spend against you, a big independent expenditure, and you're going to lose. So everybody's scared of big oil. The people who are taking the money are the friends, and the people who aren't taking as much money are still worried that big oil is going to spend against them.
Big business was in control. It ran the government.
What I always say to constituent companies that are in my district, always know that I will work with you because you employ my constituents, but know that I don't work for you. I'm not on your payroll.
How did things get to be like this? Has it always been this way? Let's look at the history of oil.
Cheap oil prices have been a big part of growing civilization over the last 150, 200 years.
How did it start? Let's ask the professor.
It really started in 1862. John D. Rockefeller and a couple other individuals formed a small refining company in Cleveland, Ohio. The oil industry at that time was a very new industry, and it was an extremely competitive industry. And what Rockefeller noticed is that prices would skyrocket, and then there would be overproduction, and the bottom would fall out of the market. And as a result, he started to think that there might be a way to gain more stability in the market if you could consolidate a number of companies so that they could coordinate their decisions.
If companies coordinate their decisions, can they control the market?
He and his associates began buying up a number of refineries, and by probably about 1882, the Standard Oil Company was in control of about 80 to 90% of the refining capacity in the United States. Standard grew huge, primarily via merger. The chosen method was to buy people out who were in trouble. And when representatives of Standard Oil would approach competing refiners with offers to buy, sometimes the refiners were happy to sell. If they weren't happy to sell, then Standard would sometimes use other tactics. They were certainly very much in favor of any kind of industrial spying that they could engage in. They also would use price cutting. Rockefeller used to refer to price cutting as sweating. If it became necessary to sweat a competitor, if someone didn't want to sell, Standard would drive its prices down. Sometimes they may have even driven them down below their cost in that region, and even if they didn't drive them below their costs were so much lower. That would make it very difficult for the other refiner to compete. At that point, it becomes difficult to hold out. And so your options become very few. It's almost like you have to sell out to Standard Oil.
What I say goes, see? I'm the law around here.
How Standard was able to do that is they would simply lower prices in one area, keep them higher in all the other areas in which they operated, or even raise them in other areas to compensate for the lower profits or losses they might be incurring. Now, normally that's not a very rational strategy, but it may have served Rockefeller quite well in terms of setting an example of when I offer to buy your refinery, I would suggest you sell to me. If you force me to sweat you out, I will still buy you out, but at a much lower price. Now, Rockefeller also thought that having refining control was not sufficient because the oil still had to be shipped, and that shipping almost always occurred by rail.
Rockefeller next strikes a deal with the railroads to get rebates on his shipments.
So in essence, the railroads would charge you a certain amount of money, but then they would rebate some of that money back to you, which in essence lowered your costs. Rockefeller, given the size of his shipments, was able to get pretty healthy rebates, which gave him a significant cost advantage for delivered oil. He also got what were called drawbacks. Drawbacks were actually rebates on competitor shipments, which the railroads didn't tend to talk about those, but that even increased further his cost advantage.
Standard Oil took control of the industry by special rebates and drawbacks from the railroads, price cutting, or sweating the competition, and industrial espionage.
Those were very common tactics as Standard grew into, eventually the Standard Oil Trust of New Jersey.
By 1899, Rockefeller and Standard Oil have almost complete control of the oil industry.
So they had retail outlets, they had wholesale outlets, they had oil fields, they had huge control in refining, and they had very significant control in transportation. The supposed goal is to stabilize the industry, but another goal could be that less competition may lead to higher prices and less choices for consumers.
Is that bad? One of the oil men Standard sweats out of business is the father of a woman named Ida M. Tarbell. In 1901, this one woman challenged the power of Standard Oil. She uncovers many of Standard's secret and predatory business practices, which she compiles into the history of Standard Oil.
I think what she really accomplished was, she vilified Standard Oil, and she really helped the American people understand a number of the practices that the company had engaged in. She had interviewed unbelievable numbers of people, and she had poured over unbelievable amounts of documentation.
According to the New York Times, her book is one of the top 5 works of investigative journalism in the 20th century.
Standard got to be such a bad name in the public's mind that they actually would buy out companies and leave the companies' names intact. They didn't want it known that Standard was really the owner. So it had gotten to that level. It's interesting that Standard took no action to even respond to the charges that Tarbell raised. He really didn't want to get into a public relations war. And so he didn't like Tarbell. I think that was pretty clear. And I think she didn't really care for him either. I find it fascinating today. Companies care very much about their public relations. And in that period, Standard's approach was keep quiet and it'll hopefully go away. But it didn't go away. That's why I think Standard became the lightning rod for a lot of the anger that was evident in the country. And I think what Ida Tarbell did is she just was able to provide almost an outlet for that anger and an explanation that people could really understand. Because a lot of Standard's tactics weren't well known. Or maybe I shouldn't say well known. They weren't well understood. Even the courts decided they couldn't wade through all that information. Tarbell's articles, and later then the book, I think really were able to help people see what she wanted them to see, which was, a company that in her opinion was out of control and had grown large by secrecy and market manipulation.
In 1906, Standard Oil is charged with the monopolization of the oil industry.
What is interesting is the court took tremendous amounts of testimony and was just bombarded with huge amounts of evidence of price cutting, industrial spying, and all of these various tactics that Standard had used, and the court didn't really consider any of that. So what happened to Standard ultimately, the company was broken up. It was broken up into primarily its 20 subsidiaries. What happened as a result of the breakup is that we basically substituted 20 regional monopolies for one national monopoly. There wasn't really much in the decree to actually make the oil industry more competitive. In fact, what they said was the people who owned the shares of stock in the trust would actually get the same percentage of shares in all the subsidiary companies. And within about a year or two, the price of the stock of all the subsidiary companies had more than doubled. So the stockholders, of which John D. Rockefeller was the biggest one, the breakup was good business. They made a lot of money.
Instead of punishing Standard Oil executives, the breakup made them even more money. The largest of the subsidiary companies form a new cartel commonly referred to as the Seven Sisters.
There were 5 U.S. companies: Standard Oil of New Jersey, which we now call Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which is Mobil, Standard Oil of California, which is Chevron, Gulf, and the other American company was Texaco, and then the 2 other international companies were British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell. And the Seven Sisters are sometimes referred to as the international majors. And for probably at least 30 years, maybe longer, they exerted a lot of power in the world oil markets.
All of these companies are descendants of Standard Oil. During the 50s and 60s, the Seven Sisters do significant drilling in the Middle East.
It probably lasted up until about 1970. The success of OPEC, that put a lot of pressure on the Seven Sisters, and that just tended to kind of dissolve.
Today, the descendants of Standard Oil have started to merge back together.
I think one of the constants between the growth of Standard and the present day is mergers. Standard's primary, if you will, weapon for growth was mergers. Now, there's nothing wrong with mergers. If you look back at the 1990s especially, and even up to the present day to a degree, the oil industry, huge numbers of mergers. I mean, Exxon and Mobil used to be two separate companies. They are now combined. British Petroleum and Amoco used to be two separate companies. They are now combined. Exxon was a Standard descendant. Mobil was a Standard descendant. Amoco was a Standard descendant. After BP Amoco, after that merger was completed, then they bought out Atlantic Richfield, which is another Standard descendant. The merger motivations, they could be for market power, to enhance your ability to charge higher prices. The stated reason for most of the mergers that occur in the oil industry is really to gain expertise, to cut your costs, and to become more efficient. Mergers are the one constant I see between Standard Oil and the current industry. We haven't seen the likes of that company again.
That may be a good thing. But it's interesting to know the kind of business practices these companies were founded upon, so we make sure they don't use them again. Let's simplify the topic. What exactly is gasoline?
It's a type of oil. It's a type of oil.
Where does gasoline come from?
The ground. I think it sort of comes from different places in the ground other than America, like, let's say, Africa or something like that. A fossil fuel is, the fossils, it's like a fuel-y sort of example, so I think they call it fossil fuel because of that.
Okay, too simple. Let's try again.
How is the price of oil set? Most Americans think that somebody rigs these prices. Please, somebody describe in detail how the price of oil is set. Are you rigging the price of oil, or is somebody rigging the price? Who chooses to answer the question first? No volunteers. We'll go the way we started. Mr. Raymond.
I'll volunteer.
Thank you. That's called an involuntary volunteerism. Tell me, from the time it comes out of the ground, how is the price set?
The price is set on the world market by willing buyers and sellers as to what willing sellers are willing to sell it for and willing buyers are willing to pay for it.
Well, it's not so important that you know how these things are done.
I don't understand that. I don't grasp that concept.
I'm not sure my constituent is pleased with the answer, but nonetheless.
What the oil companies have to realize is this is hurting the whole country. We're hurting. In other words, if you keep raising the price of gas and people can't even afford to drive their car to work, you're hurting your country.
I mean, they like high prices, but high prices can also do lots of damage to economies. And so you don't just want to jack the prices as high as you possibly can, because that's going to bring a lot more supply onto the market that would now be economically feasible. And it's also going to hurt your customers. And if it hurts your customers, then who do you sell all this oil to? It's a very difficult game to play, so to speak.
Game? What kind of game is this? Who are the players? These guys. But what about the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries?
OPEC was founded, I believe, in 1960, and what they really decided was they wanted to have more control over the rate at which their natural resource was being extracted.
In Iran, Britain suffered another reverse with the nationalization of its huge oil industry and confiscation of the properties amid scenes of violence.
What happened once OPEC joined the game?
It was not until the Mideast oil embargo in the fall of 1973 that most Americans began to recognize the vital role that energy plays in our lives, and that we could not look to domestic energy supplies to fill all of our needs. Gasoline stations ran dry. Factories were forced to close. Lights were dimmed. Thermostats were lowered. Carpools were formed. People took the bus. Then they talked about it. Then they talked about it. Then they talked about it. How did we lose our energy independence? In this 20-year period, the total energy demands of our growing population and our increasing standard of living doubled.
The United States foreign policy of the 1970s was a disaster, and OPEC put a stranglehold on our economy and caused us to suffer a severe set of recessions.
You know, the oil companies also made a lot of money then, but the countries made huge amounts of money.
OPEC gained power and huge profits by controlling the supply of oil. But as some oil supplies nationalized, politics entered the market in a new way, as the U.S. learned in the 1970s when OPEC turned off the oil.
And when that hit, it hit dramatically.
Oil prices went up significantly. They went from probably $3 or $4 a barrel up to $12 a barrel.
And what happened is you saw oil prices increase in such a way that it shocked the U.S. economy.
The idea behind OPEC is to actually work together to control output and therefore affect prices. What really proved to be a uniting factor for them was their dislike of the Israelis and their disapproval of the West's support of Israel. Really all OPEC did is they just decreased the rate of flow. And given how much demand existed, and if you decrease the rate of flow of the oil, supply decreases and prices go up.
Until the early 70s, America possessed an oil-producing capacity in excess of our needs. This was the foundation of our energy independence. We imported oil, but as a matter of choice, not necessity. When our demands at last outstripped our capacity to meet them from domestic sources, there remained only one way to meet them, to import, and that's what we did. So here we are, facing our energy problem with one shocking experience already behind us. Certainly it's time to look ahead.
Because of that shock, between 1974 and roughly 10 or 12 years after that, we doubled mileage per gallon in automobiles. Then what happened is we backed off. We didn't push further. We didn't take the technology where it was really headed. And as a result of that, we have been declining since that period in our miles per gallon, although the National Academy of Sciences and many others tell us that we could double. We could again double it right today with the technology, and we could probably push it even further if we wanted. But after President Reagan took over, there was no more of a push to increase fuel efficiency.
Car manufacturers, too. I think they're in cahoots with the oil company.
Don't let the oil companies intimidate you, Ford.
The industries are almost in a codependent relationship in that regard.
Really?
And we're working closely with the auto manufacturers on their engine designs.
We are working with auto manufacturers on what they're going to do with engines, so it's a very similar story.
Okay, apparently the oil and auto industries do work together.
And so the big question today, and the question you ask, is,
will it happen again? Is America, the richest country in the world, really dependent on the goodwill of foreign governments for such a basic ingredient of our economy?
And that's what really worries me because of this perfect storm of events. Peak oil, climate change, global warming, and increased demand from the developing world. All of those things have come together to dramatically increase the price of oil, and we're in a very difficult situation which we need leadership to get us out.
We haven't had any public leadership trying to push America to be at the front of what is an inevitability. The end of oil is an inevitability. I'm not a smart guy to figure that out. That is just a fact. It is a finite resource.
We do not have a national energy policy that really fits with the 21st century.
So America has a choice. Some country is going to invent the next energy source. Why not this one?
Back in the 70s, we were #1 in the world in alternative energies. We were #1 in solar, #1 in wind power, #1 in hydropower. And what happened is since we're the last, we're bottom basement.
You know, we got huge problems that are just boiling over. So how much worse does it have to get? You know, we're ready. It's time. It's past time.
Has it just not gotten bad enough?
When something impacts the family budget, that's when they pay attention.
How long are people going to take this? I mean, is there going to be demonstrations in the street?
We're mad. That we're really, really mad.
The time has definitely come to switch to a safer, cheaper, cleaner, less morally questionable fuel supply.
We're sick of Congress in the hands of oil companies.
They have deep vested interest in keeping us pumping the black gunk out of the ground.
Citizens have to hold their representatives' feet to the fire on this, so that politicians know that this is a top priority of their constituents.
I'm a 91-year-old lady and I still drive. Driving is very important to me because it gives me the ability to stay alive. And when I have to pay that kind of money for gas, when it is unjustified, I am very angry about it.
I'm putting the cheap one in for $3.19. Oh, caught red-handed. That's the campaign right now.
It's these people who are the enemy. It's not the Republicans per se. It just so happens that the Republican Party is housing some of them.
How much is that going to cost you?
$48.76. And I'm not even going to keep going on it till it goes. It's like it clicked and...
At this point, they haven't done anything that is going to change the business as usual situation here in Washington.
What I'm struck with is how almost compliant the national consumer has been.
When prices are low, no one really cares. It's when prices get high that they start worrying about things.
It's not only consumer, it's the citizen, that they make demands upon those that represent them, put pressure on them, questioning them. What are you doing about this? What are you doing?
People will often complain about oil prices, but they feel rather powerless to do anything about it. They may not understand a lot of the issues, and it may also be that they just don't care.
The first politician that stands up like JFK and says, we need to make one huge investment. We need to keep human beings on this earth. We need to keep our children's children here, and there's only one way to do it. We're going to establish a NASA-like agency to do it, and we're going to set a goal, and we're going to fund that goal, and we're all going to pitch in, and in 20 years we'll be happy. That politician becomes a world leader, a respected world leader. We don't have too many of those today.
Most politicians believe that they can't tell the American people this and get themselves reelected. My wife asked me if I remember that in ancient Greece they killed the messengers that brought bad news.
Because if you look at our government now, those people are in office hopefully because we voted for them. And so if we vote for people from a more educated stance, then we will get people that hopefully will do the right thing. Maybe that's an idealist view.
Yeah, well, you know, I hate to be as cynical as I can sometimes be, but, you know, I gotta tell you, I think if voting made any difference, it'd be illegal.
Okay, you hippies, that's enough politics. We'll leave the global warming debate to others. Let's look at something that affects us all right now, such as where we get our oil from.
I think we have long-term cultural instability in the Middle East that I don't think can be solved within the next generation.
I mean, political turmoil is going to hit issues of supply. If there were to be a revolution in a Middle Eastern country that's a major producer, today we think about Iran or Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's issues with both of those countries in terms of Islamic fundamentalism, especially in Saudi Arabia. The Iranians have other issues that they're dealing with. Iraq, which has tremendous oil reserves, but the instability in Iraq has made it very difficult for the Iraqis to really be producing much oil.
I think it has a dramatic influence on our foreign policy.
I think everybody in America brings the price of oil, the price of gasoline back to the war.
I'd like to see the war end, of course.
There are no quick fixes, and there are no short-term solutions.
It is sometimes called the assassination market because in so many of the oil-producing countries, the governments are not necessarily the most democratically, how would we say it, the most democratically focused. And if there were to be some type of revolution in those situations, or one of the the leader happens to be killed by somebody else who then becomes leader. That kind of news can just send the oil markets into absolute disarray.
What would really break my heart is to see America abdicate its place as a world leader, and I think it's doing that right now.
Is oil independence good for foreign policy?
You also embrace a foreign policy where the United States is not so concerned about the ups and downs in one Middle Eastern dictatorship or another. As someone who served in uniform, that's also a good thing. I want future men and women who are in the U.S. military to think there's less of a chance of them being sent to someplace in the Middle East. And if we get off foreign oil, that's much more likely.
But certainly, as one observer said, Iraq is in the middle of the oil patch, and you might consider our being in Iraq as the equivalent of a giant police station in the middle of the oil patch to keep tranquility there so we can continue to get oil.
This is a national security issue.
I don't have any doubt that our foreign policy has a lot to do with oil and the supply of oil. I mean, here we are, a little country, the United States of America. We have 8% maybe of the reserves in the world. 2/3 of what's left in the world is located in 6 Middle Eastern countries.
It's one thing to be dependent on, let's say, Canada, which I think most people would not have a problem with, and another thing being dependent on some other countries.
Every morning I wake up, I'm very thankful that we haven't had the fundamentalists take over Saudi Arabia. Because if they did that, and by the way, they aren't very fond of their regime over there. That's a semi-secular regime as far as they're concerned. That's a very fundamentalist country over there. And if they were to take over that government, they could very easily cut off that oil. If they cut off that oil, the world's economy would collapse. We are right now at the cusp. The world is barely producing enough oil to keep our economies going.
What would happen to economies around the world if they don't get oil? I mean, just think of it for a moment. That's economic terrorism.
ExxonMobil is the world's largest non-government petroleum company in operations in 200 countries and territories. Almost 3/4 of our business is outside of the United States.
The latest number I saw was 60.3% of our crude is imported.
2/3 of our capital program, that's 65%, is outside the United States.
How much do oil companies worry about the U.S. when 2/3 of their investments are in other countries?
There are many unstable parts of the world, but frankly, many of those places we don't have to care as much about because we and the Europeans and the Japanese don't depend on them for energy.
The United States and European Union don't care about countries without oil?
We should not be as dependent as we are on foreign sources for something that's very vital to fuel our overall economy.
Because while we're paying those oil dollars, they are then using them and funding the terrorism that's coming back to haunt us.
And the irony of this is, so much of the dollars we're sending abroad, particularly to the Middle East, to purchase this product, ends up in the hands of people who are not very nice in terms of the way they view the United States.
That's why we have to move away from the dependence on Middle Eastern oil. It's for these very reasons.
And in many respects, we're paying them to undermine us. That doesn't make much sense to me.
Another aspect to that scares me the most of all is the fact that countries like China are coming online and consuming oil at a rate that will equal ours, if not exceed it.
China doesn't have much in the way of oil production ability. They do produce, some oil, but the rate at which their economy is growing and the rate at which India's economy is growing, their oil demand is just going through the roof.
That's why it's important for the United States to lead on conservation technology and new forms of energy. If we take a proactive stand now, I think we'll not only benefit our own environment, but we will also be trade leaders because every economy will experience high energy prices, and the market that leads first will benefit most.
I actually started thinking about this probably 40 years ago. Maybe it was the scientist in me. I knew that oil and gas and coal couldn't be forever. And I asked myself, what does that mean? Is it 10 years? Is it 100 years? Is it 1,000 years? And then I learned that M. King Hubbard, who worked for the Shell Oil Company, had predicted in a very famous speech in San Antonio, Texas, had predicted that the United States would peak 14 years later, that we'd reach our maximum production in oil. By the way, we were then the world's largest oil producer. He was ridiculed at the time, but he was right on target. In 1970, we did peak.
Has America been running out of oil since the 70s?
He predicted the world would be peaking about now.
And the same scientist, Hubbard, says the world is going to start running out soon.
And the question I always ask is, if he was right about the United States, which is a microcosm of the world, why shouldn't he be right about the world?
Who else knows that we're running out of oil in America?
Oil production in mature basins, particularly in Europe and North America, has been declining. Meanwhile, OPEC production has increased, but is now approaching its current capacity to deliver.
OPEC is approaching its peak?
The government has financed 2 studies. One, the Department of Energy financed a study by SAIC, a very prestigious scientific engineering organization, commonly known as the Hirsch Report, and a report that was prepared by the Corps of Engineers for the Army, dated last September. Both of them make very dire predictions about the future. The Hirsch Report says that the world has never faced a problem like this, that the mitigation consequences will be unprecedented. There are startling words like this used. I'm asking the question, why hasn't our government claimed ownership of these 2 things that the taxpayer paid for?
The oil industry says one thing.
Scott Noman, manager of Exxon's Economics and Energy Division, on Tuesday briefed aides with the U.S. House Energy and Commerce Committee on the company's oil demand outlook, according to committee staff member who attended. Quote, Exxon said they don't want to build any new refineries in North America because of flat demand for petroleum products by 2030.
And then the same company says the opposite.
In just 25 years, global energy demand is expected to increase nearly 50%, with oil and natural gas needed to meet the majority of that demand.
Which is it?
Well, there will be a crisis, and it could spin out of control any time. Oil goes up and down. It is exquisitely sensitive to prices, exquisitely sensitive to supply and demand. It's sensitive to rumors. It can go up and down $2 or $3 on some kind of a rumor.
So oil companies use every opportunity to jack up the price of gasoline, and it's all based on our dependence.
Why doesn't the consumer do something about it?
You need to understand the history of the U.S. consumer and its love of cars.
What does he mean? Are we also to blame?
Transportation makes up 3/4 of the use of oil here in the United States. American consumers want bigger and better things. Where a lot of that technology is going over the last 20 years, instead of going into increasing the miles per gallon, it's going into making the cars run with more power behind them at the same miles per gallon.
The manufacturers are selling increased performance, but when they're talking about increased performance, they're talking about shaving off seconds in the time for acceleration to go from 0 to 60. Now, I don't know who has to go from 0 to 60 in a time like that. Maybe law enforcement officials, so you could provide some special consideration for them. But the fact of the matter is, the technology is there. There's not a will to use that.
People treat cars as a given. Oh, it's my car. I turn the key and I drive it. I never change the oil. I don't check the air pressure in my tires. I just drive it. I never watch. I don't do anything. I just get from A to B.
A lot of what the consuming public does is driven by advertising.
Is if something shows up on the television repeatedly, whether this is for advertising or in the news, we may overestimate the extent to which that event or that product is desirable, or to the extent to which it is frequent.
And let me tell you something else. For the consuming public, you go into the showroom, any showroom of any automobile dealer, and you look at the sticker, and the sticker says 22 miles a gallon, country 16 miles a gallon, city or whatever. It's all phony. Those figures are inflated by at least 40%. It's even been publicly acknowledged by the Environmental Protection Agencies.
He means the Hummer's advertised 15 miles per gallon is actually more like 9 miles per gallon.
One of the areas in which mass advertising can certainly have an influence is that it tells people what is possible to own.
If we don't see it advertised, then we don't believe it's possible.
The auto industry will tell you, we produce what the consumer wants. Yeah, but the consumer wants what television advertising tells them they want.
Is there a price gasoline has to reach before we buy more fuel-efficient cars?
I'm tempted to say that's the $3 question or the $4 question or the $64,000 question. I mean, It's probably a minimum of somewhere a little bit above $3 a gallon before you start seeing a significant shift.
If the price of gasoline stays above that level, they're going to want to quickly convert to a new vehicle.
On the news in the past 6 months, I've seen at least 3 times surveys. How much are consumers willing to pay at the pump before they start going away from the pump? Well, it's free advertising for the oil companies. I love the fact that the oil companies are sitting in the background going, Joe, they just announced they'll pay $5 a gallon, raise the price.
Okay, Sam, it's a deal.
I don't know that that's what they're doing, but I really do feel like that's what they're doing. So God love them, and I love the fact that the oil companies take advantage of that, but I hate the fact as a consumer who now has to fill up a boat with 3,600 gallons of diesel that I'm paying that much more at the pump.
If you're thinking about how do you get people to buy different kinds of vehicles and get them to think about changing their behavior in the interest of, reducing our reliance on oil, reducing pollution, so forth. That benefit, it's not so much personal as it is a benefit to the collective, to the society as a whole. And that's very difficult to do in the United States. Just using the term collective is certainly seen as a dirty word.
Come here, you pinko commie hippie.
It just amazes me about Americans and our whole society. Our companies tend not to think very long term because investors don't think very long term. They want to know what's my dividend going to be next quarter. Consumers may not think very long term either. That almost seems to be an endemic problem in our country. We are very focused on what's next. And next could be the next day, the next week. Long term might be the next month.
There's a new era in automobiles. It's the new Motoramic Chevrolet. What's new? Everything.
If you buy that environmentally friendly car right now, unless it was a lot cheaper or gets much better gas mileages, a lot more reliable, or has more room for you, the benefits overall as far as helping the environment and so forth are much more distant in the future. And long-term collective benefits are a lot more difficult for people to imagine and apply to themselves as opposed to an immediate personal benefit. So in some ways, people are acting quite rationally in their decision-making in that case.
We can do it, but the only way we can do it is make cars smaller, therefore more fuel efficient, but less safe. That's unmitigated nonsense. You can still have SUVs. I want to be guided by good science. I just don't want emotional responses from the heart or gut reactions. I want to know what good science says. At a hearing we had before the Science Committee, a witness from the American Automobile Alliance, in response to my question, do you have to sacrifice weight and therefore safety to produce more fuel-efficient automobiles? His response, no. Proves my point. You can make cars that are safe and fuel efficient using existing technology.
Ford lays off 23,000 guys and keeps the guy who says, oh, I'm really sorry we have to lay all these people off. He's the guy who decided not to make fuel-efficient cars.
We have a Prius. It costs so little to fill up that tank, and it goes so far that it really wouldn't much matter what the price of gasoline was.
Do people necessarily want to spend a lot of time thinking about the long-term benefits and virtues of using alternative fuels? Well, perhaps not, as long as it's really convenient, it's relatively low cost to keep using the kinds of vehicles that we have.
The truth is that gasoline is still very cheap.
President Bush, in his last budget proposal, did quite significantly increase the amount of money going to alternatives. But that doesn't mean we couldn't have done a lot more of that a lot sooner.
We certainly know now that what we are using is damaging our environment. And we can do this, but we can't squander time.
The Chinese say that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step.
If we can spur some of those technologies and so forth, that would allow us to be less dependent on oil. But they do need help at this stage of the game.
I mean, we have to move to biofuels. The good news is the technologies are there.
Tell us about Rudolf Diesel.
He used peanut oil as fuel for his diesel engines, I think primarily because that was before petroleum products really arrived on the scene.
Regarding fuel for his engine, revolutionary thinker Rudolf Diesel said, "The use of vegetable oil for engine fuels may seem insignificant today, but such oils may become in course of time as important as petroleum." Rudolf Diesel dies mysteriously on a voyage across the English Channel. After his death, the the diesel engine was marketed as though it only ran on petroleum-based products. It took nearly 90 years to begin to overcome this misconception.
A power source like that must be a highly prized state secret. I had to find out about it.
I think the most important component to the expansion of biofuels is educating the consumer so that they understand the benefits of biofuels and the difference that it can make.
My name's Joe Blackburn, and I'm the West Coast Operations Manager for BioBeetle Eco Rental Cars. Business is very brisk, and it seems like people are getting it about biodiesel and the environmental positives it offers, and virtually a zero global warming carbon impact due to the growing of the feedstock, consumes just about the same amount of carbon dioxide as the vehicle emits, and of course it's a sustainable fuel and no war is required. It's going very well, and we need more cars.
Well, currently I have 3 USA gas stations that are selling biodiesel. It is a much cleaner fuel on a number of levels, not only for the engine, but for the environment. I mean, if you spill it, you can mop it up and throw it away. It's biodegradable, it's non-toxic, you can drink it.
You can actually drink the biodiesel?
You can. It's like somewhere between table salt and syrup, so it's not going to harm you. It doesn't taste good, but you can. Here in LA, it's coming from Coachella Valley, a company called Imperial Western Products.
So about 5 years ago, we began experimenting with making biodiesel from waste restaurant oil, and we scaled up the process, and then we built this plant that's behind me here. Right when we began, we were not able to sell biodiesel at a price comparable to that of diesel, so our market was small, mostly to people that were environmentally conscious and wanted to use biodiesel and were willing to pay a little extra for it. But now, as diesel prices have risen, we're now able to make the biodiesel and sell it at prices comparable to diesel, and even a little less than diesel.
Biodiesel, it can be made from any oil.
It's easy to make biodiesel. You can make it in your garage.
I've gone from rocket scientist to lot boy, cleaning up cars and of course working in the space program. I'm far too anal to be in the rental car business. I had this opportunity because it was going on in my backyard to go to work on the Apollo program. I built all the first Apollo spacecraft, and I spent over 2,000 hours working directly with the astronauts and testing the spacecraft.
Do you have to be a rocket scientist to understand biodiesel?
Absolutely not. It's not rocket scientist at all.
Biodiesel can be blended and used in any blend from 1% biodiesel in regular diesel up to 100% pure biodiesel. The good thing about it is if you have a diesel vehicle, you can fill up with biodiesel and you can go down the road, and if there's no biodiesel available, you just use regular diesel.
When we get a vehicle that's been running on petrochemical diesel, or dyno diesel we like to call it, we change the fuel filter after 2 tanks.
Because it is a solvent and it'll clean out any gunk that's been built up in your lines.
You feel like a celebrity driving down the street in one of these cars with the sign saying what fuel they're running on.
So this is the dirtiest clean truck in the world, but just so you know this stuff works, it's filled with biodiesel right now. And that's the sound of a brand new diesel engine. Something really satisfying about that.
Wait, how does biodiesel work?
Well, they get the little gas gun thing. They open this little door to their gas hole. And they put the little thing in the gas hole. And then pull the trigger, and then gas comes out.
And that's all there is to it?
That's all there is to it. Simple as that.
You don't have to modify your engine?
It'll work in any diesel engine. I mean, that's not to say that your engine manufacturer won't void your warranty if they find your engine with B99 in it.
Why would a cleaner fuel void your engine warranty?
And we're working closely with the auto manufacturers on their engine designs to see to it that the long life nature of engines is protected with the introduction of these biofuels.
Car manufacturers, too. I think they're in cahoots with the oil company.
Is that why someone killed the electric car? Biodiesel is only one of many solutions that exist right now.
It really could not be any easier.
And that's another thing that makes biodiesel good, is it's easy to put into the infrastructure that's in place already for diesel.
I'm a Hummer driver and it runs on biodiesel. I didn't make any conversion. I haven't noticed any change in power, no change in gas mileage. I'm getting better gas mileage out of this than I am in my Subaru wagon that I have to run premium in, and I'm running on environmentally friendly fuel.
You can still have SUVs.
There will be many dollars that are spent in terms of new jobs, in terms of green technologies.
As agriculture is leaving the area, we've really helped, adding to the local economy. If we didn't have the biodiesel plant, this facility, instead of employing 100 people, would probably employ 30.
As more people use it, of course, the price comes down. If a bomb goes off in the Middle East, nobody cares that my vegetable oil car is running off of biodiesel.
I mean, it's the fastest growing alternative fuel out there right now. And the numbers it's just going through the roof. People have been ecstatic. They've just been blown away. They're so grateful. They're just so excited to be driving, on an alternative fuel, and that it's actually available, easily accessible at a pump 24 hours a day. Yeah, I've had a very, very good response. Very emotional, really.
Can't wait till they get more stations around.
You would think that we should be able to start doing that. The one thing that comes to my mind is who owns the pumps.
But big business is not giving up. It is starting a new offensive.
If the pumps are all owned by oil companies, I can see where they wouldn't be especially interested in adding a biodiesel fuel pump.
Your industry uniformly fought it to prevent us setting a renewable fuel standard that would help us encourage the production of ethanol and biodiesel.
When it comes down to renewables or whatever, we're all for that.
Now, all of a sudden, the oil is being replaced by corn, for instance, or whatever alternative fuel. So yeah, I would take it as a threat, absolutely.
We have not really had much interaction with oil companies. The technology is not super sophisticated or difficult. The technology's been around for years.
There is one unfortunate factor, that Chevron has purchased the majority of USA gas stations, so this station in a few months will not be selling biodiesel.
Has there been a reason for that?
Yeah, it's a nuisance for them. They're a huge, gigantic corporation. They're not going to deal with buying biodiesel for 3 stations.
And you see how big petroleum is. California, I think 6 billion gallons a year of diesel fuel. That's just diesel. Nationwide, 50, 60 billion gallons a year. That's a lot of petroleum.
Chevron is like a 500-pound gorilla. USA is a flea on its back. So it's a whole different ballgame with them. USA Petroleum is actually my dad's company. They just made my dad an offer that he couldn't refuse, and so he's cashing out, really. Just 65 years old, kind of ready to move on, I guess. Bad timing for me, though.
It doesn't make economic sense for an oil company to make available to you something that is cheaper than the product that they're selling you.
When you say it's available, is it available at all the pumps? No, it's not. Is it available at the car lots? Well, maybe a little bit.
What about hydrogen? Can you run a car on hydrogen?
So it's running on hydrogen right now. But what should be coming out here is about 99% steam. This is a tank of hydrogen. From there, it gets distributed to the front of the vehicle, and it undergoes a combustion reaction much like any fuel would in a combustion reaction, and thereby producing energy. There is existing technology out there that people can implement in a heartbeat that would allow one to produce hydrogen to be cost-effective with gasoline. Why isn't this moving forward? And everybody kept telling me chicken and the egg, chicken and the egg. In fact, you can't have a hydrogen discussion with anybody without hearing chicken and the egg. It gets very annoying. Eventually we said, we're gonna try to beat both the chicken and the egg. And that's how we came up with Cyclone Energy. We took a Hummer, and literally we went down to a welding shop, picked up a hydrogen welding tank, or a hydrogen tank. We went to a garage that we were partnered with. A couple of us stood around and basically drilled a hole in the air intake manifold. Did a little sort of calculations in terms of hydrogen flow rates, but basically just put the hydrogen into the air intake manifold, turned it on. Everybody took 3 or 4 steps back. Marcus, the mechanic, butt out his cigarette very nervously. We picked straws for the guy that gets in and starts up the car. But he started it, it sputtered, and it ran. So that was a pretty big eye-opener what could be achieved. And then obviously doing research and then seeing that companies like Ford have hydrogen ICE vehicles ready to go, that BMW was working on this technology in the 70s, that the Axis powers in World War II, when fuel was completely non-existent, I believe Germany had fleets of hydrogen vehicles in World War II as well. So technology has been around for a while. If you think about it, all the space missions, all the remote power in very difficult situations, and obviously in very tricky, combustible, risky kind of environments, those are all fuel cell powered. I mean, all the Apollo missions, their power in space was fuel cell powered. So the technology's been there for a while. If you had solar panels on your home, you wouldn't need that many, but you could literally have a simple electrolysis unit, a simple compressor, and every day you would come home and fill up your own vehicle at home and you'd be completely off the grid. Now obviously that's something the oil companies probably wouldn't be too keen about.
I gather that all of you are in favor of alternative sources of fuels.
What have we learned? In 1893, Rudolf Diesel invents an engine that runs on peanut oil. He then dies mysteriously, and we're told his engines are only run on petroleum. By 1906, Standard Oil has taken complete control of the oil industry. In 1939, Shell scientists get 49 miles per gallon in a converted road vehicle. In 1946, a patent is registered for a water-injected carburetor. A few years later, Ken Cundy meets a man who claimed to have invented a similar carburetor that got 100 miles per gallon, and Shell Oil bought the patent from him, making him a millionaire. Around the same time, Shell Oil scientists get 149.95 miles per gallon on a converted Studebaker. In 1956, M. King Hubbert, another Shell Oil scientist, predicts the U.S. will reach its oil production peak by about 1970. In 1970, the U.S. reaches its peak. Just after the U.S. peak, politics disrupt our imports, causing a crisis to the U.S. economy. During this crisis, Tom Ogle of El Paso invents a vapor engine that is documented as getting more than 100 miles per gallon. After his untimely death, Tom's invention is discredited and the car disappears. A few years later, Ernie Pierce uses Tom's idea to double the gas mileage on his old Pinto. But Ernie feels threatened and discontinues the project before he ends up like Tom Ogle. After a brief effort to improve miles per gallon and develop alternative fuels, gas prices drop and consumers forget. And now, as the world approaches the peak Hubbert predicted, what will happen next?
If I had a market cornered on a resource that was becoming more and more scarce, I wouldn't want to give you an alternative either.
If Exxon continues to look into alternative fuel development, we're going to see $10 million a year for the alternative fuel development and $400 million to the CEO.
What we really need is access to explore, to drill, and add capacity of oil and gas.
The type of money that has been made off dirty energy is astronomical, and it's bought an awful lot of public opinion.
But the fact is that the United States is a mature oil province. Domestic production is declining.
We've pretty much gotten all the easy oil. The new sources that people tend to talk about are offshore, and they tend to be very deep water. There certainly can be fields found that, haven't been found yet, but we've looked awfully hard.
Everyone's got their pension funds invested in Exxon. People don't know it. They're not trying to do harm, but people have to be aware of where their money is going. And I think that hopefully we'll start to see large corporations realize the benefits of, corporate social responsibility.
It is irritating when you know that there are things that could be used that aren't being used. Part of it is the way consumers react. I'm talking simply about, do I want to run a diesel?
So the question becomes, what incentives do people have to move away from that? Because right now it's very convenient.
The big question today, and the question you ask, is the United States of America prepared to change course, to change direction when it comes to fossil fuels?
This is all about our country and the future of our country, both our national security and energy security, and not economic terrorism.
What's the quote? Evil can only happen when good men stand by and do nothing.
All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing.
So how long will this go on, and what do we do about it? At what point do we say enough?
I don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer.
No, I don't know.
Don't know.
And I'll tell you, if we're going to get through this without some really, really serious bumps in the road, we're going to have a program that kind of is a mixture of the total commitment that we had for World War II, the kind of a technology commitment we had in putting a man on the moon, and the kind of intensity that we had in the Manhattan Project.
These are pretty big issues that were solved by American ingenuity.
The government has to establish some type of project, the way we did to put a man on the moon, in order to keep human beings on the Earth.
I do believe in people, and being American and somebody that worked putting America on the moon in the 60s, I believe in Yankee ingenuity and the kind of mentality that people are free, they can do what they want to do, and it's time to step to the plate and make this change in our energy future regardless.
When you look at a picture of Chicago in 1900, you will see 99% horse-drawn vehicles. When you look at the same picture of State Street, for example, in 1907, you'll see a majority of vehicles were internal combustion engine. We can make the shift pretty quickly.
They did it then, we can do it now.
We're going to do this for the country, for the good of the country.
There are a lot of things we can do, and we're not doing them.
You got to do everything that might help make things better.
It is the great issue of our time.
And the sensible solution can come through technology that is already proven. Plans are on the shelf, gathering dust. Get them off, dust them off, and then we will add to our national security.
It's more than doable. It's efficient, it's effective, it's smart. We can do this.
I believe that the American people can rise to almost any challenge. This is going to be a big challenge.
We see a problem, and I think the American way is to be the hero and solve that problem. But the downside of that is we let it become a problem in the first place.
The good news is that if we start today to do something, the transition will be less painful than if we wait until tomorrow.
It's not enough to say something. You have to do something.
It's going to happen. Biofuels are coming, whether anyone likes it or not. It makes so much sense.
And biodiesel is not the only one, it's just the most easily and readily available.
We are a great people and we are a great country, and it's time that we step to the plate and solve these problems that are the net result of the greed of a few people that just think they have us by the huevos.
And hopefully, once that happens, it'll get the ball rolling, and it'll just be a snowball effect, and people will catch on and we'll change the world.
We can do so much better. We're capable of doing so much better. We can do better. I have every confidence in that. That's the best part of the story.
I mean, just do it, because we know it's the smart, right, sustainable thing to do, and to heck with them. We got our work cut out for us. Let's go do it.
Just one thing that might seem a little crazy, to lift up someone. It's gonna take love, it's gonna take time, gonna take everyone around. Make a change, make this world a place that we wanna live. It's gonna take a moment to turn it all around. Gonna take patience, so don't get down. Be the change in the world you want to see today. But we all know deep down that there's something going on, and it's fear that's dividing us. We're all just one, spinning around the sun. So let's all join hands and sing out loud and lift up everyone. It's gonna take love, it's gonna take time, gonna take everyone around. Make a change, make this world a place that we want. gonna take a moment to turn it all around. Gonna take patience, so don't get down. Be the change in the world you want to see today. Hey, yeah, it may seem an impossible dream, but something that's so simple could change up everything. It's gonna take love, it's gonna take time, gonna take everyone around. Make a change, make this world a place that we wanna live. It's gonna take a moment to turn it all around. I'm gonna have patience and not get down. I'll be the change in the world I want to see today. Hey, yeah, yeah.